Okay, selamat petang everyone. So today we will have a lesson on PHP. So the the title of the class is basically how to PHP the easy way. Alright. So the agenda for today is basically, first of all, because PHP is a web-based programming language. So of course, there will be an introduction of HTTP, like as in like what is HTTP, what's the structure, and then after that I will introduce PHP, which is the most popular programming language for back-end web development. And after that, I will teach about data types in PHP, and then talk about loops and conditionals. And last but not least, we'll do a simple example of a web page, if possible, because I think this class will go for a little bit too long. And before I start, so who am I? So my name is Chong. I'm a PHP, also Python and Java developer. So I had around few months of PHP experience. I have about 1 year of Python and Java programming language development. I also work with DevOps and systems administration, and currently working at RunCloud as a PHP software developer slash DevOps itself. Right. Okay. So before I start the class, so there will be some terminologies that you might need to know. So first of all is the URL. So what is URL? So URL is basically the full, how to say, like the full address of a resource. Basically, for example, example.com/someroute/moreout. So that's the full URL. And then for the route, it's basically the path of the URL, which is after the domain. So if let's say the case that the URL has the domain of example.com, the route is basically after that. So for in this case is some route and more route. And the last of that is parameter. So parameter is basically the data to be passed in for the route itself. Alright, so before I continue, do you guys have any other questions that you might want to ask? Maybe something that I missed out that should be included in here? Okay, if there's no questions, then I will proceed with the next one. So okay, so in HTTP we have 5 common methods. So we have the get method, the post method, the put method, patch method, and delete method. So if you guys have attended Cornelius class before, this one is just a refresher. So for get method is basically get the resource at this URL, basically fetch it. For post method, well, this one is basically to say that we will basically create a resource at a URL with the provided data in the form. So for example, like if you go to, let's say, Facebook, you will notice that you need, when you log in, you will passing in your email and your password, or maybe your phone number and the password. So that two fields that you fill in is actually the form. So when you click the login button, you're actually passing data, which is your email or your phone number and your password, to the server for processing. In this case, log you in into Facebook basically. All right. So for put method is usually commonly used in RESTful API. I will try to explain it a little bit. So for put, it's basically that provided with this URL, I insert data into there, right? And then for patch method is similar to put method, although we use patch to say that, okay, on this URL, we want to modify the data. So then at the back end, they will do data modification. And then for delete method, then it's basically with this URL, please delete data for this, something like that, right? Okay, so next is, so this is a typical request lifecycle for HTTP. So client side, usually for our case, as for normal people, we usually say that, okay, client side is the browser, server side is the server. Basically, for example, Facebook, Google, those kind of things. Okay, so when you send the request, first you will do an you will do an initial web page request. For example, you do google.com. So the server sees the request and then it will gives you the response, which is the web page of google.com. And then for asynchronous call using some JS event, this one is basically, for example, in Facebook, you will create let's say you want to create a command, right? So that command is actually created asynchronously using JavaScript events. So when you click enter, what you will do is that you are basically, after you type the command, you press enter or you press the send button, you are actually passing in a call to the server side to say, please create this command. And then the response is basically to tell that yes, the command is created, or maybe there's an error, and in that case the command is not created. Yeah, that's the basic gist of it. And then in HTTP, in a HTTP request, it is usually separated into two portion, which is the header and the body. And for the header, it usually holds the information of the HTTP request. So for example, you're holding in the user agent, which is the identity of the browser, or in the case of a RESTful API, basically is the identifying like who you are. Like maybe for example, you are just a company, let's say company X, you're just saying that I am company X, requesting a request for API. And then what host is this request for example, facebook.com, and then what data it wants for a response. So if it's a web browser, usually it will ask for HTML. If it's RESTful API, usually nowadays we request for JSON, but of course there are also XML, there's also XML RPC, there's JSON RPC, there's also SOAP API for older versions. But yeah, that's to give some example. And then for body, the body is basically the content of the HTTP request itself. So in the case of a request, usually we will contain the form data. And for the response, usually it's the response of HTTP request. So it could be HTML, XML, JSON, which is based on the request and what does the server returns in general, right? And last but not least, we also have HTTP codes. So HTTP codes are basically to say that like the status of the request. So in this case is that in HTTP they are separated into 5 categories. So first one is called informational. So informational is basically telling you like, okay, this is an information that you need to know. You can proceed accordingly. So we always use 101 switching protocols. This one is mainly used in WebSocket, which is another way of communicating through HTTP. And then the second type is called the successful status code, which usually starts with 2. So for example, we have 200 OK, 201 created, 202 accepted, and 204 no content. So 200 is common for like web requests. 201, 202, 204 is basically a RESTful API way of telling you that the request is successful, but they just let you know that it is for a different purpose. For example, if it's a data creation, then it will return 201. If it's just sending data for validation, then it will return 202 if the data is correct. And if it's a 204, basically maybe for example, like you are trying to request maybe request an invoice, but the invoice doesn't exist, so you can just say no content. Or maybe you can use a different method just to say that this item exists, but there's nothing inside, for example. Alright, next one, we got redirection, basically to inform the client that the request is redirected. Maybe, for example, like the web page no longer exists on this particular link, but exists somewhere else. So the server will return, for example, 301 moved permanently because it is now moved to a new location, or 302 is found, which is, yes, it is found, but it is located somewhere else. So 302 used to be called move temporarily, but recently it is renamed to found. Yeah. And next one is a client-side error, basically error that is made on the client side. So for example, we have 404 not found, the most common type of HTTP error that we know. And then we have 401 unauthorized. Basically, this one commonly used in RESTful API, although it is still common to see it on web page, just to tell you that you are not authorized to log into the system, for example. For 403 is mainly to tell you that you do not have the permission to access, let's say to access a page, for example. So that one is, I won't say it's uncommon, it's still quite common, although usually a lot of websites today, they treat most errors as not found, just to keep it simple. And then last but not least, we have server-side error. So server-side error basically means that there's an error occurring on the server side. Maybe processing error, maybe it's the server is not available, or maybe the application is not available. So if the server has a problem, then it will return error 500. If it's basically the server is unavailable for some reason, maybe the server is down, then you will get 502 bad gateway. If the server itself, let's say the server is up, but let's say Google is down, then you should get 503 service unavailable. So in a nutshell, it's kind of like this. So 1xx is go on, 2xx is here you go, 3 is go away, 4 you screw up, 5 I screw up. I as in the server. Okay, so before I continue with PHP basics, do you have any questions that you want to ask? Any questions? Okay. If no question, then I will continue with PHP statements. Alright, so PHP statements, what I actually mean is the PHP code itself. So every statement must end with a semicolon. And then usually, I mean, like, this is basically most common programming languages like C, C++, Java. So every statement ends with a semicolon. Code blocks are wrapped in curly braces for things like classes, loops, conditions, and functions. We will talk about a little bit of classes, loops, and conditions later on. Functions will be taught later when we start to deep dive into deeper into PHP itself. Alright, next we have PHP variables. Alright, so PHP variables is a little bit different than most programming languages because PHP, variables start with a $sign. So for example, like in here we have $sign var equal to 1. So this is a variable named var, and it has the value of 1. And okay, and then next it must start with a letter or an underscore. So for in this case, like if it starts with a V, it's fine. If it starts with an underscore, it's fine. If it starts with a capital S, it's fine, right? So it can contain numbers, letters, lowercase or uppercase, and underscores. And variable names are case sensitive. So what does that mean is that if there's a capital struggle and lowercase struggle, those are two different variables. They are not identical in this case. And which means that you cannot use, your variable cannot start with a number, but your variable can have number in the name, just not at the beginning. Everywhere else is fine. Okay, next. In PHP, we have multiple data types. So we have string, we have integer, we have float, also known as double, depending on how you want to say it. We have Boolean, which is basic, true, false. Array, which is a collection of values in an arranged format. And then we have object. So first of all, we start with string. So string is basically, it is enclosed in single quotes or double quotes, right? So in this case, in this example, my single quotes are in double quote format, so this is valid. And then in PHP, there's a distinction between single quotes and double quotes. So in single quotes, it is a literal. A literal means that everything within that single quote is considered a string, right? So if let's say if I run this print single quote str $str, it will print exactly the same. However, if you have double quotes, then it will basically interpret the value that starts with a $sign as a variable, and it will put, in this case, for variable str we have string, so it will print this is a string, right? So that's basically the basics of string. There are, of course, there are more things. For example, like string modification, where you can add more strings, you can delete strings, like you can delete part of a string. But that's a little bit that we will dive deeper into this in the later class. Today the aim is to have to introduce PHP basically. Okay, next we have PHP Integer. So integers are basically whole numbers without decimal points, which also includes the negative and the positive numbers. Although there's a quote in PHP where the maximum value of the integer depends on the system architecture. So what I mean by system architecture is, if you have a computer which is 64 bits, which most computers today should be on 64-bit, right? And you have a 64-bit operating system, then it will support 64-bit integers. However, if you have a 32-bit system, or you have a 64-bit system running 32-bit operating system, then it will operate as 32 bits. Okay, so in this case, in this example that I provided, the system that I'm running PHP on is on 64-bit, because the laptop I'm running on is actually a 64-bit processor with 64-bit operating system. Therefore, PHP is able to support 64-bit integers. So in this case, it is a very long value which I will not try to spell it out, but of course, this is what is reported by PHP, right? So next we have PHP Float Double. So in PHP, we do not have a distinction between float and double, because for example, in Java, float values should end with a small letter f, and double will be like normal decimal points. But in PHP, float and double are kind of the same, and therefore it doesn't really have that. Okay, and then float values can be obtained through PHP Float Max and PHP Float Min. So just to let you know that PHP int max, PHP int min, PHP Float Max, Float Min, Float dig, these are what we call PHP constants. So constant basically means that this is a value that is provided, that is basically a fixed value. So in this case, because it starts with PHP, it's actually a PHP constant. So in this case, that if you print the value of PHP float max and float min, you will get basically the maximum supported precision point for PHP. And then the maximum number of precision can be obtained through PHP float dig. So basically what it means is that it supports 15 decimal points basically. Alright. Next we have PHP Boolean. So PHP Boolean basically means that it's a true-false kind of situation. And then most of the time, this Boolean is used in condition checking. So in this case, like, okay, for example, we have var underscore true, which is true. If it's true, in this case, that this one is kind of a special case. So in if else, you can actually signal that that if it's true, like in this case, while true is true, so it will run the first statement. So var underscore true is true. Else, we will just say var true is false. So this if else is actually part of a PHP conditionals, and we will actually touch into PHP conditionals a little bit more later in a few slides. Alright, so next we have PHP Array. So array in PHP is also different compared to, for example, Java, C, Python as well. So PHP array is actually kind of flexible because what happens is that you can actually have two kinds of arrays. The first kind of array that you can have is index array. Index array as in like typical arrays where you access it by using value 0 and 1. And then another one is called, officially it's called associative array, which the array will be addressed using key, where this key can be a string, right? So usually most of the time when we hear the word array, usually the concept is that you access array elements using integers, right? But in this case, PHP allows both. You can have either all integers, it can be all strings, or it can be a mix of both, because it is just that flexible, right? So yeah, array allows mixed integer and string arrays, and then arrays also, like string, can be manipulated. So you, like for example, you can remove an element in an array, you can add an element in the array, you can do processing on the array, also slice the array, slicing as in you can split the array as you need it. But that will be out of scope on this lesson because we just want to, because this is just an introduction class. Okay. Next we have PHP Object. So PHP itself is a flexible programming language because it is actually a programming language that can support multiple types of paradigms. So paradigm is the type of programming language. So it also support like line by line, like C style imperative programming, and it also support object-oriented programming, which is similar to C++ and Java. In the case of PHP, the structure of PHP object, like the way you define PHP object, is similar to Java. So in this case, we have a class called a simple class, and then we have a property declaration. So property basically means that within the class we have an access modifier. In this case, this is a public, and we have a property called var, and then we have a default value. And then the method is also similar. We have the modifier. We state that this is a function, and our function name is called display variable with no parameters. And then in this case, this display var method basically prints out the value var. So in order to access the value of var, we can just say $this. So $this is a special notation to tell that it is referring to simple class. This means simple class, the current class. And then we have an arrow that tells that we want to get the value of var. So in this case, in this case, that when we instantiate a simple class instance, and then we call display var, we will get a default value. Alright? So PHP object-oriented programming itself, the OOP concepts, are actually quite diverse. Can be said as almost as diverse as Java, but not as diverse as C++, which is basically the de facto standard for object-oriented right now. But yeah, it supports a few things such as inheritance, abstract classes, and interfaces. We will dive deeper into PHP object and object-oriented programming in a later lessons when the time has come. And now we have reached to the next part. So we will be talking about PHP loops. And Well, before I start with PHP loops, do you guys have any questions that you want to ask? Like something like why are we skipping so many things, or any other questions that you want to know? Okay, so you mean echo as in the right? Okay, so echo is one of the method that you can print a value. It's kind of like the print function on most programming languages. So in PHP, there are multiple ways you can actually use print. You can actually use echo as well. Yeah, it's just a alternative way to print a value, basically. All right. Yeah, this is quite specific to PHP. Basically, we call it as an arrow operator to signify that we would like to access a specific thing within the class, or maybe something within the instance. Yeah. All right. Any other questions? So regarding on the arrow operator, this one we will this arrow will be used quite a lot in object oriented. So don't worry too much about it. All right. Okay. If there's no any other question, then I will continue with PHP loops. So there are four kinds of loops available in PHP. We have while loop, do while loop, for loop, and for each loop. And you might be thinking, okay, that's a little bit like way too much loop. Maybe one extra loop, but don't worry, we will continue to it. Okay, so PHP while loop. So PHP while loop is identical to most language while loops, which is as follows. So we have the while statement, and then we have the condition check. In this case, the condition check is that this loop will end when the variable I is no, the condition check is basically that when the variable I is less than equal to 10, keep running. Else, it will break out of this while loop. So this condition check is basically an expression. So it's an expression to basically inform that this while loop will operate as long as the condition check itself evaluates to true. So in this case, that I is equal to 1, right? So if I is equal to 1, then because I is still less than 10, it will print the value 1. And then the \n over here means that prints a new line, basically. And then after we printed the value of 1, then we increment number. And then we repeat until when I has reached 11. When it reached 11, then the condition will be a false, and then it will basically continue on. If let's say there's other statements down, then it will continue down there. Okay, and then so one thing that to note that the condition is basically how to say this. Before the statement, like for example, in this case, the statement, is that print and this increment. So before the loop starts, the condition is checked first. Then only the expression itself will be evaluated, right? So this one is for PHP while loop, and then after that we have another loop is called a do while loop. So the do while loop is basically follows C style do while loop, and one of the key takeaway for do while loop is that the loop itself, right? So when it starts, the expression is not evaluated. It's evaluated later. And if, for example, if let's say I is equal to 11, this print statement and increment will be run. But when it comes to the expression check, it will be a false, and therefore it will jump out. So if you ever see a do while loop, just do know that the code within the do while block will be executed once, a minimum of one. And as explained just now, the condition will be checked after the execution of the code itself. So in contrast, in the while loop, the condition will be checked first before the code will be before the code block will be executed. But in do while loop, the code will be executed first at least one time before the check will be done. Alright, and next we will jump into a for loop. So for loop is basically the same as a C style for loop. So it has three expressions. So we have the first expression is basically evaluated once. So in this case, we will basically say that we want to have variable I start as 1. And then the second expression is evaluated before statements are executed. So for loop is actually a relatively complex loop system. It behaves like a while loop, but it has additional things that can be used that will keep your code block clean. So like conditions check will be put on the top, and the statements to be executed will be put in the block. The third expression is evaluated on the end of the execution. So what I mean by end of execution is every time when the print is complete, the variable I will be incremented in this case. Okay, and I'm sorry. And one thing to note is that for a for loop, the first, second, and third expression can be used. It can have multiple expression. What I mean is that you can have variable I, you can have a comma, and you can have variable J. Don't worry about that. I will provide an example later on. After we have went through the loops and the conditionals. Okay. Alright. Next, we have a for each loop. So for each loop is commonly used on arrays. So just now we have mentioned array. So array is basically we have a square bracket. Then we have each of the element separated by a comma itself. So in this case, we have a variable string. We have a variable called string. Not as in the type of string. The name is string. With an array of 5 elements where the elements are 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Alright. So for each itself, right? So the expression is basically in the parentheses, right? And then for every single element in the string variable, the value will be put into the variable name after the keyword s. So in this case, that every time when the value in the array is iterated, it will print out the value itself. So in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And this one, it's a little bit simpler because first one is that the execution of the for each loop basically stops when all the elements in the array has been evaluated. Means when it reaches after the value of 5 and there's no more extra values, then the execution of for each loop will end right there. And at least in array, for arrays, it will also involve in simpler expression, right? Okay. Next, we will talk about PHP conditionals. So conditionals is basically means like we are basically like a code, like how to say, like we are changing the flow of the execution. So in this case, that we have 3 kinds of conditionals. We have if, we have if else, and then we have if else if else. And before I continue with PHP conditionals, do you guys have any questions on the PHP loops? Any questions? Okay, if there's no question, then I will proceed. Um, so PHP if statements are the simplest comparison. It's the simplest conditional out there. So in if statement, we have basically the expression, a single expression. So in this case, that we have a variable called num1, which is which has a value of 10, and then we have num2, which has a value of 20. So in this case is that if num1 is less than num2, which in this case is true, num1 is less than num2, then we will print the value of num1 is larger than num2. Well, actually it's wrong, it should be smaller, sorry. But yeah, so in the case of PHP if statement, right? If let's say the value is wrong, we do not execute anything about it. So we just like, if it's true, run the code. If it's false, we skip the code inside there. All right. Then after that we have the if else. So if else is that basically that if there's a wrong check somewhere, then it should be that sorry, I have made a small mistake somewhere in the code. Never mind. Okay, for the case of this, it's basically the same example except we have an else. So if num1 is smaller than num2, which is the case, it should be print num1 is smaller than num2, not larger. But if let's say for example if num1 is 30 rather than 10, then it will execute the else part, which is num2 is larger than num1 actually, sorry. It's actually num1, not num3. Okay, next we have basically the last part of this simple of a simple introduction to PHP. So we have PHP if else if else. So if else allows multiple expressions for comparison. So what it means by multiple expressions is that we can have more than a single check. We can have 2, we can have 3. The else if statement can be repeated multiple times. However, if and else can only occur once in a conditional check, but you can have multiple if after that. Means it needs to have an else before you just start with if. So in this case is that we have num1 equal to 10, num2 equal to 20, num3 equal to 30. If num1 is smaller than num2, then it should be num1 is smaller than num2. Else if num2 is smaller than num3, it should be num2 is smaller than num3, else num3 is the largest. Right? I should have caught this before this, but yeah, last minute preparations do be weird. Alright, so over here we have reached the end of the slide. So do you guys have any questions to ask? Anything that is not clear or anything? Oh, follow. Okay, give me a moment. Let me. Okay, follow. What's your question, Ili? Okay, never mind. Sorry? You have something to say? Okay, never mind. So in this case, Ili, don't worry. I will provide you an example on how the loop works. Okay. So let me bring up my Visual Studio Code real quick. Okay. Before that, can I know what's your question for the for loop? I didn't quite capture your question. Sorry, I can't really understand the question. Maybe you can type it in PHP questions, so that it's easier for me to get it. Really, because your microphone is not very clear. So yeah, if you guys have any other questions, you can just post your question in PHP questions channel, and then I can address your questions as needed. Can get. Okay, all right. Don't worry. I will address that. Okay. So first question I have from Ame is that want to ask when to use while, when to use do while, when to use for, and when to use for each loop. This question is kind of a very open-ended question because it comes to a little bit of a programmer understanding and and code cleanliness in general, because some companies have different code style. Although don't worry, I can tell you like when to use while, when to use do while, when to use for, and when to use for each loop. All right. So for while loop, so for while loop itself, uh, one of the things that while loop can do is, let's say that let's say you are doing processing, right? So let's say that you are basically doing like a random number generator. You are basically like calculating a random number, and then you want the loop to basically progress until reach a specific value, right? So for example, is that we have a random number of, for example, of let's say 46 first, and then we have a while loop. So while loop itself, let's say you want the random value to be equal to, okay, while the random value is not equal to, for example, 50, right? So if the value is not the same, then we would like to have random value will be, we will start, we will basically say that I want to have random value of 0 to 100, for example, in this case. So while the so while loop is good for situation where the conditions are not exactly known by finite count. So what I mean is that because in the case of random number, the random number is basically, it generates random numbers all the time. It never, how to say it, I won't say that it won't give you the right number. It's just that the amount of time taken to reach that number will it will take some time to reach it. So in this case, for example, like while the random number is there, so maybe for example we do a quick print. So we print a rand, and then we add a new line. So in PHP, it's a little bit of a complicated story because most languages will do a plus for string concatenation, but PHP uses a dot. So yeah, that's kind of it. Okay, so if we run this statement, so this statement, so in order to run any PHP code on command line, we can do PHP and then the file name. So the file name is called print.php. So in this case that it will, so when it goes into the loop, right, it will check if the number is not equal to 50, then it will keep printing, it will keep assigning a random number to the rand variable number, and then it will print the value. So in this case, we get all the numbers that are not equal to 50, and then when we reach the number 50, the requirement is, how to say, the requirement is satisfied, and therefore it will break out of while loop. So while loop is good if you have a condition where you do not know when it will reach, but you know the condition to reach for that situation. All right, so that would satisfy the while question. And then the next one is the do while loop. So do while loop is, how to say, I need to find, let me find a quick example. Give me a moment. So okay, how do I do it this way? Alright, so let me just do it. Let me just use roughly the same code style as this. So for do while loop, we start with a do, and then we have a while. And then while here we have ran is not equal to 50. Alright? And then, so in the case of a while loop, usually the condition check usually the variable that you want to look for has to exist before that. But in the case of do while loop, you can actually put the value in here. So in this case, maybe we just duplicate this code. We duplicate line 4 and 5, we put it here. And then let me just comment this code out. So if I run this code, let me increase the size of this thing. Okay, if I run this code, you will see that the code, so basically it will run line 9 and 10 first before the check is done. So in this case, our first run you get 86, the next run you get 66. Basically you didn't get the value until when you reach 50, then only you get the correct condition, and then it will break out of the loop. So so it's basically a little bit different, as in like how you need to start, how do you place the variables. If it's like how to say, so while loop is more suitable if, let's say, the value is known, the variable has a value, then you can use a while loop. However, if you do not have the value but you still want to have the feature of a while loop, you can actually do it this way. You can use a do while loop. And then for for loop, okay, for loop is usually done for things that has a finite value. It's much easier for the case where you know how many times the execution should happen, and you want to do some processing. But although in this case we will do for a simpler way. So for example, that we want to do a for loop of iterating numbers from 1, and then we would like to keep this for loop running while variable I is less than equal to 10. And then for every time the loop is run, we would like to increment the value of I by 1. Okay. In this case, we would like to do it this way. So we would like to know the total, the sum of all numbers from 1 to 10. So first we'll put a total on the top with the with a empty value. So here what we will do is we will have, come on. So over here we will have a total will be plus and equal to the value of I. And then after that, we would like to print the value of total. Okay, so when I run this line, so it will say that the sum of all digits from 1 to 10 is 55. So this one is good if the condition, if the condition is Correct. And this one is usually more rigid compared to do while loop. Although, so to be fair, for Ami's question is that it comes to like how do you want to implement the looping itself? Because loop itself is very flexible. As long you get the conditions right, then any loop technically can be done. It's just that which one is more suitable for your use case? That will be the question. Okay, Ami, I hope that answers your question. Although I'm very sorry because it's a little bit, I'll say, if it's a little bit complicated. Yeah. Ami, does that answer your question? Hello, Ami? Never mind. If you have any other questions after that, then maybe we can proceed. Maybe we can address it later. So, for the question of a for loop, because it looks like while loop, well, actually it is. So, for loop and while loop is really quite similar. It's just that the difference is that, like in a for loop, you will put that start condition inside the for loop rather than you pull it outside. Because, like, recall that in a while loop you can have the condition outside. So maybe you call it j, and then we have a 1, and then while variable j is less than equal to 10, then we can that's not the right one. So we can print the value of j, and then we just do a new line every single time. So, and then we also need to increment j++. Okay, so for for Ili is basically like the overall look and feel is roughly the same. Okay, let me duplicate. Let me make the code identical. So this one is I. So for the case of Ili's question is that the both of this loop will do the same thing. However, the appearance of it is different, but it will achieve the same objective. So the difference is that for while loop, your the variable that you want to evaluate will start outside, then only it goes into the loop. For the case of a for loop, then you have the variable inside the for loop, and then inside the expression for for loop, and then you don't need to have the increments on the inside of the while loop and the starting point on the outside of the while loop. I hope that answers your questions, Ili, in this case. Okay, alright. So glad to know that it helps. Okay. Does anyone else have any other questions? Oh, it's okay, Ahmad Safwan. No problem. We actually okay, give me a moment. So yeah, actually this lesson is actually recorded. So this video will be available on I believe will be available on Krenovator channel later on. Give me a moment. Let me reply to Ahmad Safwan real quick. Alright, so if that's the case, do you guys have any other questions before I proceed with a little bit more extras before I end this lesson? I feel like now is not the right time to make a simple web page, but I can provide a few more examples to basically complement the lecture slides. Alright, so do you guys have any other questions? Okay, so extras. Yes, Cornelius, we have extras. I mean, the slides are I mean, the slides, I try my best to provide a good explanation, but some of the things that I put in the slides, I mean, the slides are quite limited in terms of how much things I can put in. I can now, so I can add more things in if you want. Okay, so okay, let me put my slide alongside and then oops, give me a moment. Nah, Cornelius, the building a self-driving car with PHP is kind of a little bit sketchy though, because because the language is not very suitable for real-time applications. Okay, I don't want this appearance, but it happened. Okay, okay, so okay, let me just do a quick demo. So what happens if you put variables? So real quick, so as per example, if we just do a variable called some variable, this is okay, no problem. But if you do one variable equal to 3, that is not accepted, because what happens is that it doesn't expect a number, it expects a variable. So in this case, a variable means that it needs to have it needs to start with a letter. So if I change this one into A, it's accepted. If it's a small letter A, it's accepted. If it's an underscore, it's accepted. If it's a dash, it's not accepted because it is unexpected. It needs to be part of the letters, numbers, and underscores, right? So next is next we have a string. So for string, let's say we have example, and then we just put the example in single quotes. Okay, so if I do the following, so print single quote of the variable example, and then I run this, you will see it outputs exactly example. It's not output the actual example value. It just prints out the entire variable name instead. However, if I switch this into a double quotes, and then I pull it this way, this is an example, and I run this, now it says that this is an example. So double quotes allow you to put variables into a line, and it will print no problem. However, of course, if you still want to use a single quote, which is not exactly, yeah, true, Cornelius, it is like an abstract in Python, but yeah, this is in the PHP style. Okay, but what if, let's say, you still want to use a single quote for this line 5? Well, you can. So if I comment this out and then I paste this message, I paste this line again. So if I replace this to a single quote, then you realize that now the example is no longer blue because it is now not recognized as a variable. However, if I do a dot and put put single quotes on this is n, when I run this line, it will just say this is an example, and I need to add a space, and then when we run again, now this is the correct output. So in PHP you cannot use plus. That's not exactly it doesn't really work because the problem with PHP is that plus is actually a mathematical It's a it's a math operator. It is not, how's it is not it is not for strings. For strings it need to be a dot. Then only you can when you can use it to concatenate. Although there's really no reason for PHP to not support, but I guess it's part of language specification. I cannot complain about it. Okay, so this is for PHP string. Before I continue, do you guys have any questions, or maybe you have some examples you want me to try? Some wacky examples that you want me to explore? Because to be fair, PHP is kind of interesting if you start diving diving deeper into the language itself, because it has quite a lot of nice things and also not very nice things. But yeah, you need to figure out what's the right way to do it. Okay, so Cornelius, can I answer this question when ended, because this one is a little bit complicated to answer. Because basically, just to let everyone else know, the question is that when writing a PHP server, does it use an asynchronous model like Node.js or multi-threading? I mean, the simplest answer I can say is that no. It doesn't have a very good multi-threading and asynchronous model, but however, there are alternatives which I will explain it, but it's kind of out of scope for this lesson. Yeah. Okay, so next thing. Okay, for integer. So let me just. So yeah, I think integer doesn't really have much to talk about. Float and double. Actually, I should provide an example, because I got a suspicion that the float max float min is wrong over here. So let me just do a quick double check. So print a PHP float max, and at the same time we have float min, and then we also add a new line just to keep it look nice. Okay, so if I run this code, my slide is wrong. I need to fix this. So yeah, so after this lesson, I will also include a slide for you guys to go through if you like to. And I heavily advise that if you want to learn more on PHP, you should experience it yourself, because this slide, because if I want to provide a full understanding of how PHP works in depth, right, it will be a very long class. It will be probably a few days class kind of thing. So yeah. Okay, so Boolean, well, Boolean is okay. Array, oh my god, array is a very fun thing. So you can have array in the form of this way. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But at the same time, you also can have array in the form of keys, a key and value. So in this case, key 1, and then you can have a value of 1. And you can have key 2, and you can have a value of 2. But also, PHP allows mixed case. Means mixed keys and values. So we have 0, that the key of 0 that maps to a value of 1. You also can have a key of A that maps to the value of 2, and we also can have a value of 10 that maps to a value of 3. However, do note that if you use do note that what happens is that the value of 4 will do the wrong thing. Like what I mean is that if I do a print of array 3, if not mistaken, it will do array to string. Okay, never mind. So in this case, we can use print underscore r. So print underscore r is it'll print a human readable version of a variable. So as you can see is that we have a key of 0 that maps to a value of 1. We have a key of a that maps to a value of 2. And then we have a key of 10 that maps to a value of 3. However, on the last one, for 4, the key is of 11 because it basically follows the value of the preceding key. So yeah, so to complete this, I will also print the value of the first array. So the first array basically is an array that has an implicit key of 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 that maps to 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 respectively. And then to round it up, if I print the value of array 2, then it will just print key 1 maps to 1, key 2 maps to 2. Alright, so do you guys have any other questions before I show a little bit, a few more examples before I continue and close on this topic? Okay, if no question, then maybe I'll give you 2 more examples. Like for example, the PHP object. So PHP object. So I will just use this example. Oops. Give me a moment. Let me clean up the code because Microsoft Word does a little bit weird things once in a while. Okay, so for this code, we have a simple class. We have a class called simple class that has a property called var and have a method called display var that prints out the value of var, of the property of var. And if I run this, then it prints out a default value. But of course, because that we have a access modifier of public var, we can actually skip this and call var directly. So because of the change in line 14, we'll print empty. Oh, sorry, it's missing a print. So yeah, you still can get the value because it just a few extra things. So in PHP, if you do an arrow operator and you point to it and you point to a name without, let's say, without the parentheses, it actually points to the property itself. However, if you put parentheses on it, it assumes a method var that doesn't exist. However, if I change this to var, I should be able to get the value. But if I remove the parentheses, it actually maps the value of this property itself rather than the variable. So there's quite some importance on writing this, but I think it will be safe to explore this deeper on the next lesson. Any questions? I think I heard someone wanted to say something, but it's muted. Okay, if no question, then maybe I should consider on if else itself, because unfortunately, because due to my very hasty slide creation, there's a bit of a mistake, but no problem. What I will do is I will do it this way. Okay, let's say we have a variable num with the value of 10, right? And then the first if condition is that if num is less than equal to 10, then we will just print num is the variable num, right? So if I run this file, it will say that the num is 10 because this condition is correct. However, if I put it to 11, if I change this num into 11, and then I execute this, and then you will see that it has no output because the condition is not satisfied. It will evaluate to a false, and it will not execute line number 6. However, if I put a print down here to show that the code will proceed after this line 5 to 7, so I will just put here end of execution. Okay, and then clean this up, I put a new line. Okay, so if I rerun this, and then it will say end of execution because the if here is not executed, it just jumps to end of execution. But if I change the num back to 10, and I run this again, you will see num is 10, end of execution, like this. Alright, but what if, let's say, we want to go a little bit deeper? Rather than we put end of execution, rather than we just say end of execution, maybe we would like to put a better message for this. So we can add an else. So maybe we just say that in this case we just say num is larger than 10, and then we if we run this again, if I put the num into 11 and I run this again, now it says that num is larger than 10, end of execution in this case. So the use of else is basically that if the first expression evaluates to false, it will jump to else. But let's say we switch it up a little bit. Let's say we put num2 is equal to 20. Alright, and then we change this to larger than 20, and then we also, based on the example of the if else that we have here, let's say we have an else if num is less than equal to 20, and I need to remember to put a dollar sign. Alright, and then we have an else, and then we have a statement, else statement that says that print num is larger than 20, and then for the else if, I put that num is larger than 10 but less or equal to 20. Okay, so this num2 is an example, is a mistake. So let's say I put 11 here, and now I execute this line. Give me a moment. So missing semicolon. Okay, so now with a number of 11, the first if is false, and then it will evaluate to the second one, and then this one is true, and therefore it prints line 9, and then end of execution. But of course, else if can have multiple copies of it. So let's bring it a little bit more. Let's say put here 30, and then I put here larger than 30, and then I put here num is, for line 12, I just say num is larger than 20 but less than or equal to 30. And then if I put this to 20, if I put the variable num to 25, and then I execute this application, and it will just say, it will just jump to line 12 because the line 6 check is false, line 8 check is also false, and line 11 check is also false, and therefore line 30 is not evaluated because this one is done, and therefore it will jump out of the entire if else statement itself. Okay, with this example, I would like to say that the lesson is now finished. Before I end this lesson, do you guys have any other questions? Okay, if there's no any other questions, then I will this class, and I would like to say thank you for attending this event on weekend night because yeah, it's pretty close to 10 p.m. over here. If you guys have any other questions after this lesson, you can just let me know in the PHP questions, and I will try my best to answer as needed. Yeah. So yeah, yeah. Thank you guys, and have a great night.